The weight of metal. The small pawn shop sat on the corner of a quiet street, its wooden sign swaying slightly in the afternoon breeze. Inside, the soft chime of a bell echoed as the door opened, breaking the peaceful silence. Dusty shelves lined the walls, filled with trinkets, old watches, and forgotten treasures. Margaret, the elderly shop owner, sat behind a counter, polishing a silver locket. She had owned this place for decades, watching people come and go, each carrying stories hidden within the items they traded. She could often tell, just by looking at a person, whether they were there out of necessity or nostalgia. When the soldier walked in, Margaret immediately noticed his tired eyes, the way his shoulders slumped under the weight of his faded uniform. He looked hesitant, as if stepping into the shop itself was a difficult decision. She set the locket down, sensing this was not just another customer. This was someone with a story. Eric stepped forward, his boots scuffing against the wooden floor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered object. With careful hands, he placed it on the counter, a tarnished military medal, its once bright surface dulled by time. Margaret's sharp eyes flickered from the medal to the man standing before her. The way his fingers lingered on the edge of it, as if reluctant to let go, told her more than words ever could. "How much can I get for this?" Eric finally asked, his voice low, almost distant. Margaret picked up the medal, turning it over gently in her palm. The weight of it wasn't just metal, it was history, sacrifice, and something deeply personal. She looked up at Eric. "Are you sure you want to sell this?" she asked softly. Eric hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I need the money," he said, but his voice wavered just enough for Margaret to hear the doubt underneath. She studied him for a moment. This wasn't just about money. There was something else. Something deeper. But she knew better than to push too hard. "Not yet." With a sigh, she placed the medal back on the counter, her fingers still resting on its surface. "Let me take a closer look," she said, giving him time to decide if this was truly what he wanted. Margaret picked up the medal again, this time examining it more closely. The weight of it in her hands felt significant, not just in metal but in meaning. The design was familiar. A prestigious military honor, one rarely given. The edges were slightly worn, the surface scratched, but it still carried an air of dignity. Turning it over, her eyes caught a faint engraving on the back. The initials JRW were carved into the metal, the letters delicate but clear. Her brow furrowed. Something about them tugged at her memory. She glanced up at Eric, whose gaze was fixed on the counter. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his breathing slow but controlled, as if bracing himself. "These initials," Margaret said, her voice careful. "JRW. Whose do they belong to?" Eric's jaw tensed. His eyes darted to the medal, then away just as quickly. "It belonged to my grandfather," he said, his voice quieter than before. Margaret didn't speak right away. She had seen many people walk into her shop over the years, some desperate, some broken, some simply looking to part with a piece of the past. But this was different. There was something in the way Eric couldn't quite meet her gaze. Something in the way his fingers twitched, like he was resisting the urge to take the medal back. "This is a high honor," she said finally. "You don't see these often." Eric swallowed hard. "I know." Margaret studied him for another moment, then set the medal down gently between them. "Tell me, son," she said softly, "why are you really selling this?" Eric looked away, his chest rising and falling in deep, measured breaths. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he finally answered, "I don't have a choice." Margaret didn't push him to speak, but the silence between them stretched, heavy and unspoken. Eric's fingers curled into a fist on the counter, his knuckles turning white. Then, with a quiet exhale, as if releasing a weight too heavy to bear, he began to speak. "I served for 8 years," he said, his voice steady but distant. "Deployed 3 times. I've seen things I'll never be able to forget. Things I don't talk about." Margaret didn't interrupt. She simply listened. "This medal," Eric continued, glancing down at it, "belonged to my grandfather, James Robert Walker. He fought in World War II. A decorated hero. but he never talked about it much. Said war wasn't about medals or glory, just about surviving. And making sure the guy next to you did too. A small, sad smile flickered across his lips for a second, then vanished. When I was a kid, he used to tell me stories. Not about war, but about life. He taught me how to fish, how to fix an old truck, how to stand up for what's right. He was the reason I enlisted. Eric swallowed hard. I wanted to make him proud. Margaret could see the pain in his eyes, the burden of memories he carried. She nodded slightly, urging him to go on. He passed away a few years ago, Eric said, his voice lower now. I promised I'd keep this medal forever. But life doesn't always care about promises. He hesitated before continuing, shame creeping into his expression. I lost my job a few months back. Bills started piling up. I did everything I could, odd jobs, whatever I could find. But it's not enough. Rent's due in a week, and I don't even have enough to buy groceries. He let out a bitter chuckle. So here I am, selling the only thing I have left of him. Margaret's heart ached. She had heard many stories of hardship in the shop, but this one felt different. This was a man willing to part with his own history, his own family, just to survive. Her fingers brushed against the metal, as if it too carried the weight of his struggle. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with something deeper than sympathy. Eric, she said softly, your grandfather's story isn't over yet. Margaret didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached out, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the metal, as if weighing its history in her hands. Then, without a word, she pushed herself up from the stool behind the counter and turned toward the back room. Eric watched her go, confusion flickering across his face. He opened his mouth to ask where she was going, but something in the way she moved, deliberate, almost reverent, made him stay silent. A few moments later, Margaret returned holding a small, time-worn box. She placed it gently on the counter and lifted the lid. Inside was an old black-and-white photograph, its edges curled and faded with age. She picked it up with careful hands and turned it toward Eric. It was a picture of a young woman, Margaret, decades younger, standing beside a man in uniform. The resemblance to Eric was unmistakable. His breath caught in his throat. That's your grandfather, Margaret finished, her voice barely above a whisper. Eric's eyes widened. He took the photo, his hands slightly trembling. How do you know him? Margaret let out a slow breath, as if she had been carrying this story for a long time, waiting for the right moment to tell it. Your grandfather saved my life, she said. It was during the war. I was just a girl then, living in a town torn apart by bombs and fear. Soldiers came through, but not all of them were kind. Some took more than they gave.